Okay, just do a quick sound test. Okay, welcome back, everyone. So we're on a new episode of How to Voice Reposition Chords. I've changed the name for now for How the French Learn Harmony because it's a little more accurate and I think it kind of sells right away what we're doing. Because what we're doing here is not just reposition chords, but it's really from the French perspective. So in the French perspective, learning harmony, you're building above and below. So what we have here is a semi-completed exercise. So the last couple episodes, we had just the soprano, this top line, and we had to find the bass. It took us some time, but we eventually found the bass. This is all root position chords. And now we have to find the middle voices. I have filled in the beginning middle voices to help you out, but nevertheless, those of you who probably tried the exercise have found that it was quite difficult. So let's just play the musical excerpt real quick. Okay, so that was just to get the sound in your ears. So now we have to fill in these middle voices following the rules for root position chords. Okay. So just a quick review of some of the basic concepts so we're all up to speed, but I won't take very long. Remember, for root position chords, you want to follow the path of least resistance. That means the voices are going to move as little as possible. So if you look in this diagram here, all these voices are moving just the bare minimum in order to complete the chord. Again, this is not for composition. Okay, this will help free up your composition, but we wouldn't want to hear this music perform live. It would be very stale, but it's going to give you the foundation so you can compose, you can orchestrate, and you can do fugue. So the order of preference for the path of least resistance is that you want to stay on the same note whenever possible. So in this example, you can see that the tenor is staying on the D. Next, if you can't stay on the same note, you want to move by step. So we see the alto is moving by step. And as a last resort, if you can't go by step or stay in the same note, then you can leap. So in this example, we see the tenor leaping in order to get to his next note. Quick review of deceptive cadence. I do have a tutorial on YouTube, how to voice deceptive cadence. Check it out if you want to go in depth. But as a reminder, leading tone goes up to the tonic and other voices move in opposite direction to the bass. So for example, here you see this first example, the soprano is going down, the alto is going up because it has the leading tone, and the tenor is going down. Likewise, in this second box over here, you'll see that one of the voices is moving up, that's resolving the leading tone, but the other voices have to move in opposite direction to the bass. Another really useful for reminder for reposition chords, and I never learned it until I moved to France to actually get this training. I did so many Bach chorales in America and really struggled, and something so basic no one ever told me, had to move across an ocean to learn this. But for reposition chords, if the bass is moving by step, the other voices need to move in opposite direction. So you can see right, oops, go back. So you can see right here, the bass is moving step going from a 4 to a 5 chord. And here as well, 4 to a 5 chord. So the bass is moving up, and you'll see all the other voices, soprano, alto, tenor, are moving in opposite direction. The exception to this, of course, is the deceptive cadence, which you just saw, in which the leading tone has to go up to the tonic. But otherwise, when the bass is moving a step, you go opposite direction. If you do not move in opposite direction to the bass for reposition chords when the bass is moving by step, here is what's going to happen. You could see we have a 4 going to a 5. Okay, so the bass is moving by step. And notice that The soprano, which was on an octave, if it does not oppose the bass movement, instead moves in parallel, okay, moves up in the same direction, you're going to have parallel octaves. So this rule of moving in opposite direction to the bass, it's not some arbitrary rule. It's designed to ensure that you have good voice leading. One final thing is the doublings. So I think most of us probably assume this, but I want to make it really clear. For root position chords, you are to only double the root. Okay, we know, of course, the deceptive cadence, we double a third, and consistently we're seeing the deceptive cadence is where all the exceptions seem to lie, which is why I have a whole tutorial on it because it is so important for root position chords. Okay, but you always double the root. So in this diagram here, you see we have root, fifth, root, third. We have root, third, fifth, root. We have root, root, third, fifth. If we do not follow this consigne, as we say in French, okay, the conseil, okay, the little piece of advice, you're going to have so many problems, it's not even funny. So in this example here, I am doubling the fifth on this first chord, okay? We have the soprano on a C for an F chord, and we have the tenor. They're both on the fifth. Afterwards, we have parallel octaves, right? Because the general tendency is the path of least resistance. But if you're going to be doubling the fifth, the path of least resistance is going to lead you astray. In addition, by doubling the fifth here, notice that we don't, first of all, it's like end of story because we have parallel octaves. So there's really no discussion. But in case you were curious, we are missing the fifth. Okay, so you see what happens when you try to do these unconventional doublings, it's not going to go well. Now, this is for root position chords. That's going to really open up for first inversion, which we're not at yet. One other thing that can happen is we'll have parallel fifths. So in this case, notice that the tenor is on the fifth again with the soprano. And presumably the composer recognized that if the tenor were to have gone up, like we just saw, there would have been parallel octaves. So in this case, I jumped down a fifth, which is kind of clumsy. You know, when every time you do something clumsy to cover a bad voice leading, it's probably a sign that you should just start over from scratch. And as a consequence, we get parallel fifths of the bass. Okay, so we've covered just that was a really rapid fire review of basic things that I expect you to know. I've talked about this in numerous videos, but just so it's fresh in our ears because we will need it. So the first thing we need to do is we're going to get the octave leap that is in the soprano. Remember that for the upper three voices, we can't have more than an octave distance between them. We saw that in the last episode. When there's more than octave distance between the upper three voices, it feels like it feels like a voice is missing. The texture feels really empty. So my first attempt here to voice this octave leap from soprano, I have the alto leap up to a D, and I kept the tenor. And look, the chord is pretty well balanced, right? We have an octave distance from soprano and alto, which is the maximum we can have, but it's at the maximum. And then we have a sixth distance from tenor to alto. So everything appears to be good at first glance. Now I want to quickly finish off the phrase. And again, we use the path of least resistance, right? You know, we see basses moving by step, so you just oppose it. However, something comes to our attention now that we're looking a little more closely. When we got this octave distance between the soprano and alto, it came at a very high cost. Notice that we are jumping to an octave. So technically, it's not parallel octaves because the soprano and alto are on A and D. But because they're getting to an octave and they're both jumping and they're pretty large jumps, it's gonna feel like parallel octaves or it's going to be very disconcerting, and this is not acceptable voice leading. Okay, so we're going to have to revoice that octave leap. So doubling the soprano and alto is not going to work. So in this case, I had the alto leap up to an F, and now we have a distance of a sixth between soprano and alto. So still good. We're within the limits of an octave maximum between these upper three voices. But we have the tenor on the fifth and alto on the fifth. And what did we just see? Why did I just show you the rules for reposition chords, specifically when the bass moves by step? We saw when the bass moves by step, and we're doubling, this is reposition chords, and we're doubling the fifth. It's just gonna be just a danger like zone. It's inevitable. There will be some kind of fault. There'll be parallels. There'll be bad voice leading. So we don't want to double the fifth. Okay, so in that case, we don't have any options for the alto, but I think it works nicely on this F here. So we need to adjust our tenor. So prior we had the tenor was on the F. So can we move it to a different register? So in this case, I put the tenor on the D. Okay. And this is the third of the chord. So it's definitely much safer. There's less of a risk of those parallels. But remember the issue we ran into with the alto and the soprano. Notice that by bringing the tenor to this D, leaping it to this D, which is necessary, and some kind of leap is necessary because that soprano is leaping an octave. So the other voices are going to have to move to maintain good equilibrium. But as a result of this, we have the tenor in octaves with the soprano, and it got to that octave with the soprano by mutual leaps, simultaneous leaps. So that's going to feel like parallel octaves, and it's just not acceptable. Okay, so we have to make this work. Obviously, if I'm giving this exercise, it's because I've already figured out there's already a solution. Okay, so in this case, we have the tenor leap up to the B flat. So we're doubling the root. Now, for a sixth chord, you can double the root or the fifth because this technically is not a deceptive cadence because we don't have the five. Yet, I find in general it is still nice to double the third for the sixth, even if you don't have a deceptive cadence. But in this case, we don't have any options. We have a very controversial situation, which is the sleep of an octave, and we have to do drastic measures. Okay? So notice as a result of this, we have a direct fifth with the alto. Okay? This is much less egregious than the direct octaves leaping to an octave together. It's still a little controversial, but another thing to keep in mind is when chords are a third apart, a lot of times they have similar properties. For example, the one and the six are the relatives, right? Relative major, relative minor, and they often replace each other. So sometimes for certain chords that are third apart, these kind of controversial, like direct fifths, don't feel as egregious to the ear. That's a little too complicated for today's tutorial, but I will be expanding upon that in a future tutorial. So in this case, this is the best option. Now we want to fill in what's missing. So we decided on this fifth here. And here's a case where the path of least resistance, which I illustrated at the beginning, does not work. Remember, path of least resistance, we want to move as little as possible. So we got to this B flat with the tenor. And then here, the path of least resistance would say you want to keep it on the same note, and then you go by step. But when you do that, notice that you have parallel octaves with the soprano. Now, why is that? Well, in this case, notice that the soprano is leaping to its note when, in theory, if it were to have followed the path of least resistance, it should have stayed in the same note, right? This is a G minor chord, G, B flat, D. So the soprano could have held its note. But the reality is, in a lot of these exercises, in the music in general, the soprano needs to move around so it has an interesting line, or it might have want to change registers. And when it does that, that rule of the path of least resistance isn't going to hold up. So in this case, if I do not adjust the tenor, I end up having parallel octaves. In addition, as we often see when we have parallel octaves, we don't have complete chords. We're missing a fifth, we're missing a third. So this is completely unacceptable. And here is our final solution for this opening kind of half phrase. Notice that I have the tenor leaping to get out of this bind. Okay, so the soprano was leaping unnecessarily, right, for melodic reasons. I couldn't keep the tenor on its same note following the path of least resistance, so I had it leap. Okay. And then also remember the work that we did to get to voice this octave leap, which is very controversial. We had to leap the other voices, but make sure we avoided the semblance of parallel octaves by having parallel jumps to an octave. Okay, so notice that we have all that hard work we did, and it probably would take a lot longer if I haven't already like planned what I want to say and I have the examples, okay? But notice that that only yielded like a quarter or a sixth of the entire exercise. However, that octave leap was the most controversial part of this exercise. It was the hardest part. So even though visually it appears that we haven't gotten a lot done, we've actually gotten a lot of work done, and we're maybe a third, maybe close to halfway done. All right, so now we get all of phrase one. So one thing we have to be really careful of is you'll notice over here that we have two separate systems, right? Because there's a limit to how much horizontal space you have. You'll definitely have this as exercises. It's much nicer when you have a continuous line, but if it's a longer exercise, you have to go on to the next system. So what I'm going to do to ensure that I have good voice leading is I'm going to add an extra measure on the new system because previously we figured out there were two essential phrases. And I'm going to include the beginning of phrase two on the same system as phrase one so I can make sure that I have good voice leading across these phrases. This is a principle that you also will have to grapple with orchestration and fugue. And I'd like to show you two examples. So this is a clip from a video I have on my website, so it's not on YouTube, but it's Are You Ready for Fugue? And I talk about, modulations and such. But in one of the examples, I explained that in a certain part of my fugue, or my second fugue, I had to voice this section first because this was the second exposition, so it's an important part of a fugue. And then once I decided the correct dispositions I wanted, I had to go backwards and get into there. Otherwise, if I had worked on this section and I worked on this section, it's possible that it would be very difficult to get from section one to section two. Another example from orchestration, this was from the Common Mistakes of Beginner Orchestrators video I did about a month ago. I talked about when I was orchestrating my symphony, Help Us on the Way for Orchestra. In order to make sure that the orchestration sounded fresh, I had to orchestrate this second section okay, the beginning of a new section here, and the ending of this other section kind of back and forth at the same time, shall we say. Not literally like, you can't do two things at once, but I had to work on them side by side to ensure that it sounded fresh. So you'll notice here, I talked about how I have the trumpet come in with the melody, and I left it out in the texture prior, and some of the other instruments as well as the harmony. So this comes directly from harmony. When I talk about in orchestration and fugue, when I talk continuously about like orchestration's harmony, fugue is harmony, this is the source, okay? So, consequences of not thinking across the phrases. So we have phrase one, okay, and we have phrase two. So I'm trying to get the ending of this phrase here, and voice leading looks good. You follow the path of least resistance, unless there's some other reason, some stronger reason. And phrase two, voice leading looks good. However, did you notice that the end of phrase one, we have a fifth between the tenor and the bass, and the beginning of phrase two, we also have a fifth between tenor and bass. This is what happens when you don't think about traversing the two sections. You're going to have a major problem. Now, obviously, in a harmony exercise, obviously this is unacceptable. The whole exercise is null and void when you have parallel fifths or octaves, or an acceptive cadence is not properly voiced. The whole exercise is null and void. But the risk isn't that bad because it's very easy to fix. Versus if you're doing orchestration and you don't think about l'enchaînement, as we call it in French, the connection between these two sections, you will have weeks of reworking, especially if it's a 2T section. You will have weeks of reorchestration. It is so expensive. Likewise, the fugue, and the problem with fugue, of course, is that very few people appreciate the fugue. It's an amount of energy that you have to put in, and then you have so few people who appreciate it. You're really going to regret not thinking about l'enchaînement, or the connection between these two sections. So, of course, something that would be easier is if you put it on the same line, but it's not always possible, and it is your job to think across systems. To illustrate this a little better, I put these parts of these phrases on the same system, and now it becomes clear as day, right? We have a spacing here at the ending of phrase one. We have a spacing at beginning of phrase two, and it's clear as day there are parallel fifths. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose which is more important. Okay, unfortunately, there's no such thing as equality when it comes to music. That's absolute tyranny. Okay, there's always something that's more important, and that's going to help you a lot in these exercises. Instead of thinking, I don't know where to start, like what's the most important? Well, the ending of a phrase is really important, beginning of a phrase as well. But here I chose the ending of the phrase. Okay, so I put the voicing that I wanted. And now I'm free to get before and after. It does take some time to know which is more important. Is it the ending of the phrase, the beginning of the next phrase? Maybe we'll get into that in another episode. Okay, so I got this ending of the phrase and I got into the next phrase. But what do we have? We have a problem. The path of least resistance, right? I presented the path of least resistance at the beginning to establish good voicing principles, right? You want to move as little as possible, okay? Stay in the same note, step, finally, you have to leap. But you cannot become addicted to the rules. There is no rule that is your final savior. You still have to think, you still have to listen, and you still have to suffer, okay? So in this example, notice that by keeping the tenor on the same note, okay, which would be the path of least resistance, we get parallel octaves. Now, keep in mind, I know I say you have to suffer, but it's a beautiful suffering, right? Okay, you work out all the problems here in harmony exercises, so then when you get to orchestration and fugue, it's a lot easier. It's always going to be very difficult orchestration and fugue, but that pain and anxiety and the inevitable frustration is much diminished, okay, when you have regulated these problems in a harmony prior. Though it's not always possible to address harmony first. Um, Now, this is a result because notice that the soprano, which was on the F, okay, and based on the path of least resistance, soprano would have gone to this E here, but instead it's leaping. And of course, it's leaping to either gain a new register or for expressive purposes. We can't have a chained soprano. But because of that, we're going to need middle voices that are robust and know how to, adjust. And of course, a composer performer that knows how to do that. Okay, so the solution is clear. The soprano knows where it wants to go, and then you gotta choose another voice that can complete the chord. So here the tenor is leaping up to the C sharp. Okay, now we want to work backwards. So we've already set this chord here, the ending of phrase one. We have l'enchaînement, or the connection into phrase two. And so now we want to work backwards, okay? I talk a lot about working backwards and forwards in fugue and orchestration. And as you can see, the source is in harmony. That principle is already baked into your harmony studies, okay? Um, Another advantage of harmony studies, it goes much quicker. Like you can do a lot more exercises in the time it would take to do fugue or orchestration. So it's a good way to kind of keep you up to snuff, shall we say. So basic principles, right? Bass moves by step. What do we know of bass moves by step? Other voices move in opposite direction. So we have a four going to a five. So just work backwards. And then the path of least resistance whenever possible. Okay, so now we are almost done with the phrase one. We still have phrase two, but we're making good progress. So as you can see here, by figuring out these problems, potential problems across the phrases, now we can work on this middle section because the grave danger is you start from the beginning and go all the way to the end of phrase one, but you don't know if it's going to work with phrase two. If it doesn't work with phrase two, it's null and void. It's exactly the same with orchestration or a fugue. You can't put all your eggs in one basket. You constantly have to test out here, test out the orchestration here, test out, these entrances, test out this configuration. Because if there's no smooth way of getting there, you're gonna have to cheat and do some kind of patchwork solution that's just, it's inferior composition. And we want excellence, okay? And the way that you get the excellence, of course, is taking risks, but also getting the technique, just getting just the basic group position chords, first inversion at some point, second inversion, and then of course there's modulations, sequences, and the dominant sevenths. Okay, though that's the whole package. With the dominant sevenths, there's the traditional use, and then there's the non-traditional use, which helps you with modulations. This is all baked into harmony. Okay. Oh, okay, so we're gonna get what remains. All right, and it was quite easy. I basically just used all the principles that I laid out of today's episode. So as a reminder, bass is my step. We have a very stepwise bass here. We have going from a five to a four to a five to a six. Okay, so you better oppose that motion or you're gonna have so many parallels, it's not even funny. Okay, of course, with the steps of cadence, the leading tone has to go up. Other voices still move in opposite direction to the bass. And then when you get out of receptive cadence, we often have to use leaps, okay, in order to regain good spacing. I have a new short tutorial. It's about 3 minutes. in which I kind of guide you in when to use leaps to get out of a deceptive cadence. You may want to check it out when you have a moment. All right. So that wraps up the first complete phrase of this exercise. Remember the awesome work that we did. We actually got some of the second phrase, so we're really set up for success. So now all we have to do is fill in the inner voices for the remainder. For episode 9, I hope I'll be able to do it for next week. I will be taking the first 3 completed assignments. So if you want to start like working in harmony and get some feedback, I will be correcting the first 3 completed assignments. If I receive it in time for the deadline, I think I put Thursday. Make sure that you properly voice the deceptive cadence. Otherwise, I will not correct the assignment. Okay. And make sure you have no parallel fifths and no parallel octaves. You can get the assignment and do it for free on my website, barneygmusic.com/fundamentals of harmony. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.